Hi everyone, we are Group 1, and I am Hai Wenxin. Today we'll be talking about the housing crisis in Los Angeles and how a natural disaster turned into a policy disaster. Let's start in January 2025. Wildfires tore through Southern California, destroying over 10,000 houses. But for renters, the real crisis did not start with the fire. It started after, with rent hikes, eviction notice, and no protection from the system. Here's one example. A Bay Area home on Zillow saw its rent jump from $15,900 to $29,500. That's an 86% increase right after the fire. And it wasn't an exception. It became the new normal. What we argue is this today. Wildfire may be natural shocks, but housing crisis that followed was man-made. The real damage came from policy failure, weak enforcement, and market exploitation, and it hit low-income renters the hardest. In today's presentation, we will walk you through three parts of the story. First, how the market broke down. Second, who suffered the most. And third, why governance failed to respond.
Hello, I'm Xinyu Jing. In my section, I will explain how wildfires causes rental housing market efficiencies. Let's start with what we observe in the rental housing market. One clear sign is price distortion. Rents have spiked dramatically. An analysis shows that rent jumped around 20% after the wildfires. Another sign is transaction distortion. Landlords and property managers raised rents opportunistically. Also, tenant bidding wars have intensified. So, how do wildfires create these market distortions? Let's first look at the supply side. Wildfires cause direct housing destruction. Data from First American shows that just in the first week of the wildfires, about 1.1 to 1.6% of Los Angeles housing stock was demolished, causing a sharp reduction in the existing housing inventory on the market. In fact, the destroyed housing is roughly equivalent to the total new house delivered in 2022 to 2023 combined. On top of that, reconstruction takes time and resources, so the housing supply cannot bounce back so quickly. Furthermore, a chain reaction is created. With fewer housing assets available, many landlords delay further investments, and investors facing increased sense of risk cut back on new supply commitments. Now let's consider the demand side. A recent report noted that over 70,000 people had to evacuate in early January. They faced choices: rebuild on site or sell their land to use insurance payout to buy new homes. Slow updates on reconstruction costs and subsidies push many to choose temporary rentals, driving up demand. Additionally, there's information asymmetry among market players. Tenants lacking reliable information end up developing pessimistic expectations about disaster developments and insurance claims, which raises their willingness to pay. This results in an excessive risk premium being factored into rental pricing, triggering bidding wars and an irrational surge in rents, as noted in a BBC report. There is no doubt that wildfires generate negative externalities in the rental housing market. But do they impact everyone equally? We will explain how on this in later sections.
Hello, I'm Liu Zhuoran. So now it's my turn to talk about the distributional inequality. Why low-income and vulnerable groups suffer disproportionately? The impact of the 2025 Los Angeles wildfires on the housing market has caused great inequality within the city. Low-income tenants have become hidden victims. Maria was just a typical example. As you can see, the Los Angeles wildfire was extremely fierce. Actually, all the people were seeking for the rent protection. But low-income groups and vulnerable groups suffer most. Why? There are 4 reasons. The first reason is that when rents increase or they lose their residence, low-income individuals face significantly higher marginal living costs. They lack savings and social network support, so a single relocation can cost them rather big negative impacts. The second reason is that vulnerable tenants who lived in the non-disaster area suffered from spillover rent increases due to the overall damage to the urban housing supply. However, the policies are mainly targeted at the direct disaster victims. The third reason is that there existed soft evictions against vulnerable groups, especially targeting at immigrants, single mothers, and individuals with language barriers. The fourth reason is that the public resources are insufficiently allocated and are prioritized for the middle class or visible victims. This leads to spatial squeeze and class entrenchment. According to all of the above, we can analyze the negative externality knowledge points. First, wildfires have directly damaged homes in affluent areas such as Pacific Palisades, but the resulting housing shortage has driven up rents citywide and forced the unaffected tenants to bear a lot due to spillover effects. Second, in order to gain higher rental profits, landlords evict existing tenants. This is a self-interested transactions and is transferred to society at large, leading to a significant number of people unemployed and displaced. That's all about this part.
Hi, I'm Yi, and now I will talk about how governance failure, not just the natural disaster itself, has deepened the housing crisis in Los Angeles. We will focus on three dimensions of failure: pre-disaster preparation, post-disaster response, and long-term urban resilience. Let's begin by understanding the big picture. Wildfires are sudden shocks, but poor planning, weak policies, and delayed responses are what turn these shocks into prolonged suffering. What we want to state is that disaster is the trigger, but governance is the crisis. Now, let's walk through each of these dimensions. The first failure is what happens before the disaster ever strikes. When wildfires burned homes, there was an immediate reduction in housing supply. But what followed revealed a deeper issue. The government was not adequately prepared. Emergency shelters were insufficient and poorly managed. Many were overcrowded, unsanitary, or even unsafe, and some people had no place to go at all. This led to a sharp increase in displacement, which in turn exacerbated the housing crisis. The second dimension of governance failure happened after the disaster. When housing market failed to stabilize on its own, the government didn't act fast enough. There was no rent freeze, and enforcement of protections was weak. This gave landlords the opportunity to raise rents aggressively or even evict tenants. Tenants already financially vulnerable were forced to leave. While a 30-day eviction notice existed, it offered little real protection, especially in an overheated market. With too little time to find alternatives, the risk of displacement increased again, pushing more people into precarity and deepening the housing crisis further. In the long run, there are some systematic issues that make cities fragile in the face of disaster. For example, poor urban planning and land use, which exposes homes to wildfire-prone areas, underinvestment in fire prevention infrastructure, weak policy implementation and regulatory oversight, and politically motivated decision-making that prioritizes short-term interests over long-term safety. When these issues persist, they ensure that negative externalities like displacement, housing shortages, and social instability will return with the next disaster. So without reform, the cycle still continues.
So what have we shown today? Yes, wildfire triggered a crisis, but the deeper problem are the rent surges, evictions, and displacement, which came from market failure and governance breakdown. And it was the most vulnerable renters who paid the highest price. And that's why we believe policy must change. Disaster rent protections should go beyond 30 days and be strictly enforced. We also need long-term investment in affordable housing, urban planning, and fire prevention, just not after a disaster, but before the next one. We cannot stop the wildfires, but we can decide whether each one becomes another housing disaster. The fire was natural. What happened after? That was man-made. And thank you for listening today.